Good everything, Nubians. Hi, surprise. We're doing a little pop up with Sam Reynolds, Unlocking Astrology, the key master himself, unlockingastrology.com. Hi, welcome.
Hello, Karen. It's good to be back. And
Good to see
hello,
you.
Nubians. What's going on? It's good.
What's good? What's good? I'll drop a link in the chat so you guys can pop in if you want to ask questions later. But Sam reached out because he said something's going on in the stars and we need to know about it. So I was like, what's happening? And let us know what's going on.
So what's happening is that on Saturday, Venus started a retrograde in Leo. And everyone might think like, okay, it's a planet going retrograde. Why didn't you do that for Mercury going retrograde? All these other things. Why is that a big thing? Well, based on the research of one particular astrologer, whose name is Nick Dagan Best, and I also can put in a link of a 2-hour talk I did with him recently. One of the things he discovered, I would say about 15 years ago, is that he saw a correlation between the cycles of Venus and cycles of injustice that affect African Americans. And so one of the things, and this is also going on the heels of August, and you're like, well, so what? It's August. August happens every year. Why is that a big deal? Well, one thing is that August is pretty important in African American history as a month. So to have this Venus retrograde happening in Leo, which also has significance related to us, and then to be on the heels of a month that has a lot of significance for us. And if people are wondering, like, well, what's so deep about August? Okay, let me just do a quick run through. There was Black August, which was 8/21, 1971. The first indentured Africans arrived in Virginia in August. Gabriel Prosser and Nat Turner both started their rebellions in August. The Black nationalist Marcus Mosiah Garvey was born in August. The Underground Railroad was formed in August. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington in 1963 in August. W.E.B. Du Bois passed away also in August, and Fannie Lou Hamer speaks on 8/22, 1964, around the same date as Nat Turner's rebellion at the Democratic National Convention. So a lot happens in August.
Mm. I just have to put up a church finger because why is that just a coincidence, Sam Reynolds? And we're here with Sam Reynolds, Unlocking Astrology, who wanted to talk about this event. Venus is in retrograde. Is that what it? So we all
Yeah,
know about Mercury.
Venus is retrograde. Venus
Correct.
is retrograde. Yeah, but go on.
Venus is retrograde. So when people talk Mercury in retrograde,
It's
it's
not a
correct.
car. It's not a car. It's not in retrograde. It's not in reverse. It's not in park. It's retrograde. Right? It's going
Okay.
backward from
So
our perception.
so Mercury retrograde is something where people like don't sign contracts, don't do this, don't do that. Oh, there's always going to be some drama. So people, it must be Mercury retrograde. What is the difference between Mercury retrograde and Venus retrograde? What?
Well, Mercury retrogrades. I mean, one particular thing is the um the amount of times that it happens. So Mercury retrogrades 3 to 4 times a year, whereas a Venus retrograde may happen every 18 months or so. It's roughly almost 2 years. And then it's not even just the retrograde per se. It's like Venus retrogrades actually only in particular signs. Mercury will go and change related to elements. So it's going to start retrograding in Earth during this year. Whereas Venus retrogrades largely in has done it in Capricorn, in Gemini, in Leo. It's now started retrogrades in Libra, and anyone who has seen, for instance, Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code and the the five petaled rose, that's really symbolizing Venus. Venus actually in her retrograde cycle makes a pentagram in the sky. And for each of these pentagram points, they happen in 8-year cycles. So the Venus in Leo, that period that we've been in that started roughly around 1999, happens every 8 years. The one that we had in 2020 was Venus in Gemini, which harks back to the one in 2012. So these happen in 8-year cycles. And one of the things that like Nick Dagan Best, who I mentioned earlier, saw as a correlation is that this seems to happen with issues that surface in the African American community. Now, I just mentioned some dates. 2012. Who? Wait, was that Trayvon Martin? Yes, it was. 2020. Was that George Floyd? Yes, it was. And so now it doesn't mean that, okay, then, every few years we're just going to have an issue. Well, on some level it does. Mercury doesn't have the same impact. And a lot of people freak out about Mercury retrograde. But what's happening for the Mercury retrograde and the same thing for the Venus retrograde is that they're going toward a renewal. They're going toward like the new moon. So when people freak out about Mercury retrograde, what they really should be thinking like, okay, Mercury is going toward a renewal point. Mercury deals with all things related to commerce, communication, and commuting. That means that we are generally called to renew our perspective on how we use these particular cycles. So for instance, if there's a friend or partner you always text, then what could happen is that you start running into problems because now you may have to change up how you're communicating. Or if you always just wait maybe just 30 minutes before you go to the airport, well, maybe you might have to do some planning to go ahead before you get to the airport. Maybe you have to do an hour because things could go wrong. But a lot of people don't want to change, so they resist change. So Mercury retrograde, for instance, becomes very difficult for people because they're more resistant to the change that's coming. And so it's not so much about, well, when Mercury retrograde, automatically everything's going to go wrong. We're challenged to renew and rethink using those words like retrograde to reevaluate how we're doing whatever we're doing. Venus retrograde is a bigger deal in that sense because it's a slower moving planet than Mercury in that sense. It doesn't retrograde as often. And like I said, Venus is how we deal with, I didn't say this part. Venus is how we deal with some measure of connection, similarity. I call it celestial oxytocin. Now, you might say, like, what's that got to do with racism? Well, racism is how we make analogs related to what we find as familiar or what we like, which also then highlights what we don't like, where we experience difference, which for us as Black people living in an oppressive society, this is where we experience injustice. So it's like white people like, well, we want to deal with things for white people and for us, what's similar, and then kind of have some measure of repulsion for what's different. And I think this is what we kind of come to deal with. Now, Venus is also important in terms of elements of African American history in other ways that maybe people haven't thought about. So a lot of people may not realize that one of the things that initiated the enslavement trade was something related to Venus. And you're like, well, how is that? Well, it was mainly, and I talk about this in a talk I give, which is the destiny of African Americans. One of the things that Europeans developed pretty much in the 15th century and even before is the need for spices. We always talk about them looking for gold, but before they even went for gold, they were really hung up on spices and particularly sugar. So the first sugar plantations was just off the coast of Africa on the islands there, and that's where they developed the first plantations. Now Venus is a planet that also deals with, guess what? Sweetness. The idea of how we have these particular tastes for things. Again, creating the things that give us pleasure, similitude, what we enjoy, all these particular things. And so the first elements of enslavement, both in terms of those islands, started from the Portuguese. And then going into the other part of the Western world where it was developed in Brazil, which actually has the highest concentration of people of African descent in the New World. This is where we find this development related to cultivating Venusian taste and habits. Sounds like you want to say something, Karen.
No, I'm just, first of all, thank you for pulling astrology through an Africana framework, through an Africana studies lens, because I think well, what's your sign? We get caught up in our rising and our moon and all of this, but we don't look at it through the lens of like, how does this impact the world that we're in, and how can we? So we're having this conversation today about Venus retrograde, as we head into the Leo season that we're in now. in terms of the sun signs, right?
Yeah.
What is it like? What do we do with this information? Because we're action space. We want knowledge with the sense of like, what do? We use this as a tool, as a weapon. Like, what do we do with this knowledge, and how do we move to better our lives in the community that we're in?
And that's my intention in terms of doing this. I mean, there's some measure of it that's research, right? I mean, I think um, Nick, who is a white Canadian astrologer, he looks at these cycles related to all different elements of history. It's a matter of curiosity for him. It's a matter of research. And I mean, he also has a keen sense of justice, but he's not looking in the broader, wider lens in terms of mobilization and political action. That's not his thing, as I understand it. And we've been friends for over 20 years. What I would say really is the usefulness of this. Well, kind of, I want to share this information so people can kind of do more what I've been doing and then be prepared. You're like, well, be prepared for what? Well, I've been eyeing particular things because I knew the cycle was coming. And we're also going into August, which as I mentioned, and I can go more into, is a very specific time. And you asked, well, why is August special? Why is that not just random? I'll go into that as well, because it does have significance related to a star that has been historically important for African people. But one of the things that we can start to do in eyeing particular things is readying ourselves and not looking at things in terms of random issues. For instance, the thing that happened with Carly Russell. Unfortunate, yes, it turns out that the system may have been less than honest with us about what happened, but we also have to be on alert with what's happening or what has happened with Rashim Carter, right? In terms of the brother who believed he had been or was being harassed by white folks, I believe in Mississippi, and then turned up missing, and then his body has been found. So that's one particular issue of injustice. And one thing that's a parallel to what happened in 2012, 2020, is that the case didn't really break open. Like he's believed to have been murdered in October or November of last year, but the case didn't really surface or get some measure of, I won't even say resolution, some measure of redress until this year, I believe sometime around March or April. So these are the things to start watching out for. The injustices that we've been experiencing from the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, all the way down, correlates to literally what I'm talking about related to this Venus cycle. Because it can actually start some 73 days before and sometime before it goes retrograde, and also can, go on after it's been retrograde. So we often think when we talk about astrology, like things happen on a dime, like with Mercury retrograde. When Mercury, for instance, because most people know that, when Mercury retrogrades, as an example, people think like when it's over, like, oh, it's over now. It's not a show. It's not when the show is over or done or the curtains close down that it's over. These things kind of then proceed and progress because Mercury then has to reconstitute itself, catch up to itself, and that takes another 3 weeks or so. So Venus is even longer, a longer period, because Venus retrogrades for 40 days. Then we can expect some measure of the aftermath of it even longer than 40 days, closer to like I said, 73 days after. So the importance for how we might start to mobilize is like thinking about and paying attention, not just to the news, like what are some of the injustices that are happening and what are we going to do about it? And then this is where I'm going to get a little more political. We have to think more long term rather than like short term actions. We're going to protest and we're going to make our feelings known without thinking about sustained action. I think we need to go back to the models of our predecessors in terms of the civil rights movement. And we can also talk about particular moments that happened in terms of, I don't think they had celestial planning, but in terms of the action, the training. A lot of people hear about Rosa Parks, a woman kind of just sitting on the bus and saying, I'm tired. And this is how we frame the story and talk about it in elementary school. Rosa Parks was a trained activist. She went to summer camps in learning and knowing how to participate in these particular actions. One thing I'm sure Greg Carr knows and probably has talked about it is that there was even someone else who had been picked to do that particular work, to initiate this particular action, but couldn't follow through. But Rosa Parks did and could. So we have to think about the training when we think about these particular cycles kind of coming up, like with Venus retrograde. What are we going to do? What kind of actions can we do as proactive steps in order to deal with that? So, for instance, when Venus goes retrograde again, and people understand that this is happening, we could start thinking about collecting these particular stories that are surfacing and using that to organize, mobilize, work with people to say, like, all right, I'm just going to say this, some shit's about to go down, and we're going to have teams on the ground. We're going to have people ready to kind of deal with this in our active aspects of our community, rather than like, oh, we chilling. Oh, look what that happened, and we got to do something about that. And then we kind of have this protest, and we're going to go and march and do all these particular things, and then kind of go home and then go back to watching television. This is what we don't have to do if we use the power of the stars. So that's how I would answer your question. I hope I've answered your question.
All right. So I can you hear me? Can you hear me, Sam? Yeah.
I can.
A couple of questions. Someone wanted to speak about Venus. Can you speak about Venus retrograde in the houses? I don't know what that means. Fern in the Knubia chat wants to know.
I mean,
what does that mean?
I can. I mean, the thing is, I mean, on some level, I'm just going to be really honest with people about, as I always am. I mean, what I want people to think is to think collectively in terms of the astrology, and aspects of it. And then also to think, one of the things I'll talk about the cycles of Venus and be reflective. Me kind of going through the houses, I guess I could do that. The problem I have with that, with the pop astrology angle, which you can read in articles, and there's lots of astrologers who like to do it. People who follow me notice I don't do it. It bores the shit out of me. Because I want people to reflect on their experience of it, not just what some astrologer says based on some amalgamation of different things and anecdotal things that may not have anything to do with their actual experience. And I know that's become very popular in astrology. But, you know, look at the suns through the sign, and look at Mercury retrograde through the signs, and blah, 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 and through the houses. And what they mean by the question, and I'm not beating up on, what did you say, Fern? So, Fern, I don't want you to feel like I'm beating up on you, but I'm also answering very directly why, even though I may do it, I want some people to resist some measure of it. So I mentioned some particular times for this, or years, for this Venus retrograde. So it happened roughly in July and August of 1999. Then roughly around the same time, well, actually it happened in September into August of 1999. Then it moves from August into July in 2007. It's pretty much in August and July in 2015. And here we are in 2023. So in just, 24 years, we're talking about a cycle of Venus going from being in Virgo into Leo. It moves backwards. What I want people to do is reflect, what are some particular themes that surfaced pretty much around that time and then after? I'll give you an interesting parallel, just as an anecdotal. So for me, now Venus actually retrograded in my 6th house, where my moon is. Didn't necessarily change as much there. This is why I'm resistant about houses. But what I do notice is that in 2007 and 2015, in 2007, I went to India for a wedding and stayed there for a month. Then in 2015, I went to South Africa for a conference. So some measure of travel seems to be the theme that I'm dealing with related to the Venus retrograde. So what I'm expecting is that there may be an invitation or some kind of trip coming my way in 2023 as Venus is retrograded. So this is kind of what becomes useful. This is not just going by houses, because if I had just gone by the house, well, I'm just going to have some changes related to my everyday life, because Leo's my 6th house, and I would be dealing with it in terms of, the 6th house deals with routines. It deals with some aspects of how people define work, health. And honestly, I can't think of particular health challenges or other issues that I experienced in 2007 or 2015. So what becomes more important for people is to use astrology, even when they just know a little bit, like I've just explained, to reflect on that time frame, more so, like I said, the summer into the fall of that particular year, 1999, 2007, 2023 to see like what parallels that might exist. Now, of course, we only have those 3 previous years to this one, but you might anticipate based on themes and issues that may have surfaced that you can start to use and leverage. So, yeah,
Yeah, I'm
sorry.
just gonna first of all thank you again because the only reason why we're doing this astrology series in Nubia is because first of all it's rooted in Africana ways of knowing, but also for me, everything that I do is about hopefully giving people tools and weapons to build their best lives. And some people believe in God, some people don't. Some people believe in astrology, some people don't. I just want to find an entryway to get you to reflect on yourself and the world around you in terms of giving you the power to step forward and do things. I think people, when they see astrology, they look up their sign and they let that guide them through their day, as opposed to them guiding themselves through that day in terms of like, what do I need to be the best me to go out there and tackle whatever I need to tackle, whether it's meditation, yoga, God, Jesus, Buddha, chimes, whatever you need, crystals. Find that way to get in to be your best self so that you can impact the world positively. Do something. So
And this
that's
is
what
where
I
we're
love about
aligned,
it.
right?
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't interrupt
Yes.
you, but this is where we're aligned. And I know, and again, I'm not, I hope I didn't offend. Was it Fern who asked that question?
Yes. And she said thank you. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
Mhm.
I hope I didn't offend you, Fern, in talking about that. But one of the things to know about me, right? And I can go just a little bit into the weeds related to this, but not too much, is I came to astrology as a skeptic. At this particular point in my life, I'm skeptical of astrologers. Now you might say, like, well, why? Are you skeptical of yourself? Yeah, I'm always pushing myself to be better. And one of the ways I think about being better, do I want to tell people what to do, or do I want to give them tools to help them do it for themselves? And I want to do the latter. And so I think there are still a lot of astrologers who, and this is the moment where astrology has exploded in a lot of different ways, who want to tell people what to do. Well, this is what this means. Well, I can tell you the legs and elements of it. What Venus represents. I called her celestial oxytocin. How we also, there's a correlation between what we have as some measure of similitude. I talked about it in terms of the history. But to kind of go through, well, Venus in the first house means that if you have Leo rising, this is going to be a time to beautify yourself and to think about how you can be much more attractive and feel attractive. And I can do that. I've done that. The problem I have found with that over the years, and which is why I don't feel as inclined to do it as much right now. It's great for sales, it's great for marketing, in the work of an astrologer, but reflection more on what these things may mean as a correlation for yourself, whether you do that through your journaling, thinking about things, will be a lot more impactful for you. Because one of the things that people miss, and this is what I talked about in my series with Karen, a lot of people think astrology is about the signs. That's a 20th century invention from astrologers. I'll blame us for it. Astrology historically has been about the planets in relation to the signs, the backdrop of it. And so the planets really give us some key signification and their places, whether we're talking about it by signs or nakshatras or something called lunar mansions. These all became how we understood the story. So if, our predecessors, say in Timbuktu or other parts of the ancient world, the medieval world, if you went back and said, like, I'm a Leo, what can you tell me about Leos? They would have looked at you as if you had your head on sideways. They would have no understanding of what you were talking about. Nobody talked about things just in relation to their sun sign. But the nature of commercialization and marketing and making things simpler and accessible has brought in and watered things down related to our art, that I don't think we're going into the depths of what astrology means. Let me give you another correlation. So one of the reasons why August, I figured out, is very important for us is because toward the end of July and then going into August for hundreds of years, I'm going to say the last maybe even 700 or more years, has gone with the heliacal rise, meaning rising before the sun, of this star called Sirius. Sirius. Yes, Sirius XM, right? So the dog star has been historically important for African people. The Egyptians called it Sotpet. right? And so they marked their actual year with the heliacal rising of Sirius as the start of their new year. The Dogon people of West Africa, Mali, and Niger, right? Um, those people also African people who actually could see that star. And what's deep about their seeing that star is that it took Europeans with the invention of the telescope to recognize that the dog star, Sirius, actually was a binary star system. The Dogon people recognized that it was not only a binary star system, but they actually think that it actually is a tertiary star system, that there are three stars that we only see with the naked eye as one star. So the Dogon people even had ceremonies related to Sirius C, the tertiary star, which they called the Star of Women. So they had ceremonies related to the heliacal rising and all the work related to that star with that particular point of view. So when we see the heliacal rising coming at the end of July going into August, this has some measure of significance for us in our history, not just because things go off or jump off in astrology or in August, but because it's always been with us. It's been a guiding star, not just the pole star, which we call the North Star, but also Sirius as well. And Sirius, I'm sorry, go on.
No, is there an alignment with me not just being at Sirius, but in many ways directing traffic and directing a vision within the Sirius space through Urban View? Is that because now that you're saying that, I'm like, maybe this was supposed to be.
Well, when I went to there, and I was like, I mean, it was an inner joke for me, inside joke for me, like, oh, look at me going to Sirius, recognizing the importance of it, and then honoring that. I would have to look at your chart, but one thing I'll say, Sirius is one of the most powerful stars in in the system,
Wow.
in the stars, and it's roughly at 13 to 14 degrees, depending on when you're born, of Cancer. 13 to 14 degrees of Cancer. Now, if you look that up, that's roughly around July 4th. Now, you will recognize July 4th as the date used for the creation as the Declaration of Independence for these United States. Do you think that's an accident?
No, not those founding fathers who studied and dabbled in the dark arts. Tho-
Right.
Those framers that studied all manner of astrology. Yes, I
They
don't think those.
knew.
Yes, they
They
knew.
knew what they were doing.
Oh
They
man,
knew what that star represented and what power it gives them. So,
wow.
recognizing the rising of the star and then looking at it in terms of its history, you can see that this is, you know, these people have, tapped into the power that comes from us and our history. So one of the things I like to say, because
Wow.
sometimes people ask me, well, why don't you use the sidereal zodiac? Right? I mean, that's what our forebears used. Maybe. We can get into that debate another time. But what's interesting, the reason why, in terms of rulership, and I talked about this in the series that I did with Karen, that rulership starts from Cancer and the sun all the way through. So Mercury rules the sign just before Cancer, it rules the sign after Leo, which is Virgo, and it fans all the way through in terms of Venus on opposite sides, and then it goes to Mars on opposite sides, all the way around. There's a question. Why did it start with Cancer rising? Like, it's called the Thema Mundi, which is the story of the creation of the world. That's what Thema Mundi means in from the Latin. Well, one of the reasons why Thema Mundi starts in Cancer, it's believed for the heliacal rise of Sirius. It was related to how it goes and connects to the tropics, the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. So that heliacal rising by which we situate is kind of the foundation by which we understand the houses, understand the signs, and the rulers, the planets that go along with them. So those become important in understanding that particular point. I'm looking at your chart, Karen, and obviously I won't talk about and reveal any particular things or elements of it. I don't see that you have anything that I can see directly in Cancer that aligns with that.
Okay.
There is a way in which your moon connects to or close to Regulus in a way that we call Anticia. So it's not direct, like there's nothing in Cancer, but there's a way by shadow point. And if people are interested in that word I just mentioned, Anticia, Antiscia, they can look up more on what that. Those are shadow points, reflection points that happens with each of the planets. As I said, a lot of people think astrology is about the signs. It's really about the planets, and the planet. And we could say that the signs give us more coordinates and a sense of where a planet has elements of power or not. That's
Mm.
how we better can understand. So a moon in Cancer is at home. So that's the place where she rules and has some sense of power.
I,
Whereas if
that
she
listen, that tracks because as I say often, I don't own Sirius XM. Sirius is not my home. Knubia is my home. That's the house that I built, right? So when you said that, immediately I was like, yes, the shadow. The shadow knows, Sam Reynolds. I'll say less. I'll say less.
oh, that was brilliant.
Yes, we want to take some questions with Knubia.